Handkerchiefs. Practical, economical, aesthetically pleasing, and apparently more popular than I initially thought. I've come to the conclusion that handkerchiefs are in a similar boat as cloaks. Everyone secretly loves them and wishes they were more mainstream, but the general population hasn't quite figured out how to make them work with modern life.
Below me.
Oh, couldn't you just use a handkerchief?
However, going by the myriad of comments left on my previous handkerchief video, there are still lots of people using handkerchiefs in everyday life, and I think that's awesome. Handkerchiefs are arguably more comfortable than tissues, more eco-friendly than those plastic-wrapped pocket packs, and way more aesthetic. Let's face it, no matter if you're blowing your nose, drying your hands, cleaning your glasses, rocking the cowboy aesthetic, or capturing a retired pirate,
A clean handkerchief, I hope?
Mine. Well, it was clean yesterday.
you look way cooler with a handkerchief than a Kleenex. And whether you want a handkerchief for fashion or function, there are options for everyone. Lacy, embroidered, satiny pocket squares, or just a low-key plain cotton hanky, whatever you want, you can find. Or make. So whether you're just starting down your handkerchief journey or you're already using handkerchiefs in day-to-day life and want to take it to the next level, there's something here for everyone. So let's dive in and level up our handkerchief game. It is a cardinal rule of adventuring to never leave home without a handkerchief.
I forgot my handkerchief.
But how does one carry a handkerchief in our modern world? One of the most common arguments I've seen against them is the issue of cleanliness. If you're using a handkerchief, doesn't it get soppy and wet and gross? Well, actually, not necessarily. If you're actively blowing your nose into a hanky, yes, it's gonna get gross. But there are ways to use a handkerchief and not end up with a soggy mess in your pocket. Christie's Corner has a really handy video on ways to fold a handkerchief to get the most use, while still keeping it nice. So I encourage you to check that out. Also, we live in the age of Ziploc bags and washing machines. Pack a little baggie in your purse or back pocket. If and when your handkerchief is used, put it into the bag, seal it up, and throw it into the laundry when you get home. Alternatively, if it's a more delicate hanky, you can wash them by hand in a sink. Fill the sink up with warm water, add a little bit of laundry soap, swish your hankies around, scrub out any noticeable spots, rinse and lay flat to dry. Handkerchiefs are made to be used and washed, so use them and wash them. Also, if your handkerchiefs are natural fiber, they're going to absorb a lot of moisture. So if you're just using them for dabbing your eyes or mopping a brow, they're actually going to dry really fast. I'm prone to leaky eyes when I get tired or stare at a computer screen for too long, so I keep linen handkerchiefs beside my desk and in my car so I can just dab, 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 and those things dry out so fast you wouldn't believe it. I've used my linen hankies to mop up some serious tears, and they are completely dry again in less than an hour. So now that we know how to care for our hankies, let's make some. If you're going for practical, you want a natural fiber like cotton or linen. Some of my viewers even make cotton flannel handkerchiefs for winter use, which I think sounds really cozy. You can use silk, as was used in more fancy historical handkerchiefs.
He who even now wears my silken handkerchief next to his heart.
But moisture tends to dull the silk, so I wouldn't suggest it for an everyday hanky. If you're going for purely fashion-based, maybe looking to supplement a pocket square collection,
I had to sell my pocket square collection. What are people's eyes gonna be drawn to?
you can go wild with your options and even look at polyester fabrics. Just remember that polyester is basically plastic, which means it is not absorbent, so it's not going to do anything when it comes to moisture. But whatever fabric you pick, remember we need a pop of color in our lives, so while bleached white is considered the default color for handkerchiefs, don't be afraid to break out some funky colored fabrics. The simplest way to make a handkerchief is by making a folded machine-sewn hem. The most common size of a handkerchief or pocket square is 12 by 12, so I'm cutting 13 by 13 to allow for the hem. Then you fold the raw edges under twice, and you can either use pins or quilting clips to hold the fabric in place. I experimented with both and found pins worked best. The clips tended to shift a bit with the machine. Then you just stitch all the way around. And here we are, one snazzy pocket square / handkerchief. Now, one thing I found when I started collecting vintage and antique handkerchiefs is that a common style of hemming is a pop of color around the edges. Some are embroidered by hand, and more often than not, they are stitched by machine with what looks like little tiny zigzags. And I figured if I'm leveling up my handkerchief game, I would be remiss if I didn't at least attempt this technique. And let me tell you, it is not as easy as it looks. I wouldn't be surprised if there was a machine specifically for making a hem like this, but on a basic sewing machine, it took a few attempts. This was my first try, and I was not happy with it. So I very carefully snipped all the way around and tried again. This time I made sure there were no little fraying bits sticking out. I also changed my stitch length to be shorter and the width of the stitches to be closer together. And it was better, in places, sort of, but still not remotely close to the perfectly hemmed edges of vintage hankies. So for my final attempt, I folded the edges over just once, as narrowly as I could. And this gave the best result of all my attempts. Still not perfect, but close enough. I would wager that in order to truly mimic that vintage feel, you'd need your stitches super close together, closer than anything I could get on my machine. So props to the hanky makers of old, you really knew what you were doing. And even if a machine embroidered hem isn't necessarily manageable, there is still a way to get that pop of color. And this is my personal favorite method. We're going to start by making a rolled hem. And with a fine fabric like this cotton lawn, you can literally roll the fabric under itself to make the hem. And then we whip stitch all the way around. Then we take a contrasting thread, either cotton embroidery thread or silk thread, and whip stitch over top of the rolled hem. You want the stitches close together to avoid any gaps showing. And you may notice here that I switched to a smaller, thinner needle. When working with fine fabrics, a larger needle is going to make the individual stitches more noticeable, whereas this little number 10 sharp made everything flow together nicely. For a more basic and less time-consuming bit of decoration, you can blanket stitch around. I'm alternating long and short blanket stitches just to mix things up. And now, if you're carrying a handkerchief, how do you make sure people will know that it's yours?
Gee, Gwendolyn.
No, sire. Giacomo.
If you have to lend it to someone or give it as a memento, how will someone know that that handkerchief is yours and yours alone? Enter the monogram, an embroidered corner with your initials or single initial that identifies your handkerchief as, well, your handkerchief. Monograms can be as wildly ornate or as simple as you want. Both options have existed throughout history. If you have an embroidery machine, this step is super simple. Pick out a monogram pattern that catches your eye and embroider away. For those of us yet to acquire an embroidery machine, never fear, we can monogram by hand. First up, find an artwork online that you like. You don't want to choose one that's too finely detailed, since you will still have to trace it out, transfer the image to your fabric, and embroider it. If you have a tracing light box, you can use that. Me, I cheat a little bit. Clutch your pearls if you like, but I put tracing paper on my computer monitor, turn the brightness up as bright as it'll go, and using the lightest possible pressure that I can, I trace the image. If you're using a thicker or darker fabric, you might need to use something like carbon paper or pouncing to transfer the image, but this lawn is light enough that I can see through and draw directly onto the fabric. Then we pop the fabric into a little embroidery hoop and stitch on the design. I usually use a satin stitch for this, as it's quite good for filling in the spaces quickly, and it keeps the back looking fairly tidy as well. Just make sure your satin stitches aren't too long, as longer stitches are prone to snagging more than short stitches. And when you're done, do a little knot at the back and run your thread under some of the stitches before snipping as close to the fabric as you can get. This will keep the back nice and neat. And there we go. Now anyone who sees your handkerchief will know exactly who it belongs to. But what if you're feeling extra?
Sure, I've ordered from Neiman's and Gucci's, but I've never actually been there.
What if embroidered hems just aren't fancy enough? Let's take a handkerchief to the next level and add some lace. But not just any lace, we're talking some serious lace. For vintage lacy handkerchiefs, the actual fabric portion was smaller than average. They also did a great job of hiding exactly where the lace meets up. As we can see on this handkerchief, the maker did an extremely narrow seam and actually worked the seam into the design of the lace to make it appear continuous. I don't know how they made the seam that clean. It's gorgeous and mind-blowing, and I am in admiration. So I'm going to do my best to mimic this, bearing in mind that most modern lace tends to be not as delicate as vintage lace, so I'm doing my best with what I've got. For this lace design, I figured my best bet would be to cut it on an angle and make diagonal seams at each corner. This isn't the most economical use of the lace, but I messed around with layouts for a good hour or two, and this is the best I came up with. Once everything is pinned into place, I started by attaching the lace to the fabric. This is done with little whip stitches in a matching thread. I trimmed down the excess fabric, folded the remaining fabric over once, and then whip stitched it down in a sort of rolled hem kind of way. Then I joined the corners using the same silk thread and whip stitching it down. I was still lost on just how they made the seams so tiny and neat, so my first seam I trimmed down quite narrow and whip stitched the raw edge of the lace in, I guess, a rolled hem. So I am quite happy with how this handkerchief turned out. I can definitely see some room for improvement, but considering that I have never attempted a right proper lace handkerchief before, I'll take it as a win. The trouble is, now I want to make all the lacy handkerchiefs. So there you have it. Some different ways to level up your handkerchief game. Which one do you think you'll try next? Let me know in the comments below. And if you have any suggestions on more ways to level up your handkerchief game, please feel free to share with your fellow hanky enthusiasts. I will be back soon with more geekery meets history sewing adventures, and in the meantime, go forth and wield your hankies.